The horrifying story of the mother who created a monster, her sexual practices that destroyed her son. In 1886, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a young preacher arrived at Martha Hill's remote cabin. What he found there would haunt him forever. Floyd Hill, a grown man with the haunted eyes of a broken child, whispered a confession so twisted, so unthinkable, that it shattered everything the preacher believed about good and evil. Martha called them sacred rituals. She claimed they would purify her son, keep him bound to her forever. But beneath her pious words lay a darkness that had already claimed more than one victim, a hidden cellar, unmarked graves, and a community that knew the truth but chose silence over justice. The preacher thought he was saving one tortured soul. He had no idea how deep the horror went, or how many others had already paid the ultimate price. When an entire town becomes complicit in unspeakable evil, who decides when the silence finally ends? The fog clung to the Appalachian ridges like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating, in the autumn of 1886. Elijah Moss guided his weary horse through the narrow mountain path, his breath forming ghostly wisps in the bitter air as he clutched his worn leather Bible closer to his chest. The young circuit preacher had been riding since dawn, carrying God's word to the scattered souls who carved out their meager existence in these unforgiving peaks. At 24, he possessed the fervent idealism of youth and an unshakable belief that no corner of the earth was too dark for divine light to penetrate. The hill cabin materialized from the mist like something conjured from a fever dream. Built into the mountainside with rough-hewn logs blackened by smoke and time, it seemed to crouch against the earth as if trying to disappear entirely. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the small windows glowed with the amber light of oil lamps, yet there was something profoundly unwelcoming about the structure. The very air around it felt heavy, pregnant with secrets that the mountain winds dared not carry away. Martha Hill emerged from the cabin before Elijah had even dismounted. She was a woman of perhaps 45 years, tall and angular with steel-gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch the skin tight across her sharp cheekbones. Her dress was plain black wool, modest and practical, yet there was something about the way she carried herself that commanded immediate attention. Her pale blue eyes held an intensity that made grown men look away, and when she spoke, her words carried the cadence of Scripture, even in casual conversation. "Preacher," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with an authority that seemed at odds with the isolated setting. "The Lord has delivered you to our humble dwelling. We are blessed by your presence." There was something in her tone that suggested this blessing was not entirely welcome, though. Her words were flawlessly pious. Behind her stood Floyd Hill, Martha's adult son, and Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat at the sight of him. The young man was perhaps 22 or 23, but there was something about his bearing that suggested either much older or much younger. He was gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, as if he had recently lost a great deal of weight. His dark hair hung limp and unwashed around a face that might once have been handsome, but was now marked by deep shadows beneath his eyes and a perpetual expression of barely contained terror. He watched Elijah with the wary alertness of a beaten dog, his body coiled as if ready to flee at the first sign of threat. "Mrs. Hill," Elijah replied, dismounting and offering what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "I thank you for your hospitality. I've come to offer prayer and fellowship to any who might welcome it." He studied Floyd more closely as he spoke, noting the way the young man's hands trembled slightly and how he seemed to shrink back whenever his mother's gaze fell upon him. Martha's smile was thin and cold. "Of course, preacher, we are always eager to receive the Lord's word. Come, the evening grows dark, and there is much to discuss." She turned toward the cabin, and Floyd fell into step behind her, with the mechanical precision of long-practiced obedience. The interior of the cabin was sparse but meticulously clean. A large wooden table dominated the main room, surrounded by simple chairs, while a stone fireplace provided both warmth and the primary source of light. Religious texts and crude wooden crosses adorned the walls, yet something about the arrangement felt more like protective talismans than expressions of faith. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and something else, something medicinal and slightly sweet that made Elijah's stomach turn. "Floyd," Martha commanded, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Fetch the preacher some water. Mind you don't spill a drop." The young man hurried to comply, his movements quick and nervous, stealing glances at Elijah as if trying to gauge whether this stranger represented salvation or yet another threat. As they settled around the table for evening prayers, a violent storm began to rage outside. The wind howled through the mountain passes, driving rain against the cabin walls with such force that the entire structure seemed to shudder. Lightning illuminated the windows in brilliant flashes, and thunder rolled across the peaks like the voice of an angry god. It was during one of these thunderous crescendos that frantic pounding echoed from the cabin door. Martha rose with practiced calm, as if unexpected visitors in the middle of mountain storms were commonplace. She opened the door to reveal a woman Elijah recognized as one of the neighbors from a cabin several miles down the ridge. The woman was soaked to the skin and wild with desperation, her eyes wide with the particular terror that only a mother facing her child's mortality could possess. "Martha," she gasped, pushing past the threshold without invitation. "It's my youngest, little Sarah. She's burning with fever and can barely draw breath. Please, you have to come. You're the only one who knows the old remedies, the ones that actually work." Her voice cracked with desperation, and she clutched at Martha's sleeve with trembling fingers. Martha's demeanor shifted instantly, transforming from cold hostility to maternal authority. "Of course, dear," she said, her voice now warm and soothing. "The Lord has blessed me with knowledge of healing herbs. Fetch my bag, Floyd." She began moving with purposeful efficiency, gathering various vials and pouches from a wooden chest near the fireplace. "I'll need to examine the child and prepare the proper medicines. This storm won't wait for our convenience." Within minutes, Martha and the desperate mother had vanished into the howling night, leaving Elijah alone with Floyd. The sudden absence of Martha's commanding presence seemed to drain all the air from the cabin, and Floyd visibly sagged as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He stood frozen near the fireplace, staring at the door through which his mother had disappeared, his whole body trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Son," Elijah said gently, rising from his chair, "are you well? You look as though you've seen a ghost." He moved slowly, instinctively recognizing that Floyd might bolt at any sudden movement. Floyd's eyes snapped to meet his, and what Elijah saw there nearly staggered him. It was not merely fear or sadness, but something far more disturbing, a depth of anguish that spoke of wounds that went far deeper than the flesh. "She'll be back soon," Floyd whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. "She always comes back." "Your mother seems to be a woman of great faith," Elijah offered, searching for some way to reach the tormented young man before him. Floyd's laugh was a broken sound, more sob than mirth. "Faith," he repeated, the word seeming to taste bitter on his tongue. "Is that what you call it?" He moved closer to Elijah, his movements jerky and unpredictable. "Preacher, do you know what it means to be pure? Do you know what the Lord demands of his most faithful servants?" Something in Floyd's tone sent ice through Elijah's veins. "Tell me, son, what troubles you so deeply?" The words that poured from Floyd's lips came in a torrent of broken whispers and half-formed sentences, fragments of horror that painted a picture too monstrous for Elijah's mind to fully comprehend at first. He spoke of his mother's sacred rituals, conducted in the darkness of their cellar, ceremonies she claimed were necessary to keep him bound to her, to purify him from the sins of the outside world. He described a holy union that defiled every law of God and man, practices that had continued since his childhood, twisting his understanding of love and devotion into something unspeakable. "She says it's God's will," Floyd gasped, tears streaming down his hollow cheeks. "She says the outside world would corrupt me, that only she can keep my soul clean. But preacher, I dream of fire. I dream of burning it all away, her and me together, because I don't know where the sin ends and I begin." Elijah felt the blood drain from his face as the full horror of Floyd's confession began to settle in his mind. This was not the rambling of a diseased mind, but the desperate testimony of a soul that had been systematically destroyed by the very person meant to protect it. Before he could respond, before he could offer any words of comfort or guidance, the cabin door burst open and Martha Hill stepped back into the warmth, her cold blue eyes immediately finding the two men huddled by the fireplace. "The child will recover," she announced, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. But her gaze never left Floyd, and Elijah saw something pass between mother and son, a silent communication that spoke of years of practiced control and submission. "I trust Floyd has been a good host in my absence, preacher. He sometimes says things that might confuse a visitor. The isolation affects his mind, you understand, makes him prone to strange fantasies." Floyd's face immediately went blank, all traces of his desperate confession vanishing behind a mask of vacant obedience. "Yes, Mother," he said quietly. "I was just telling the preacher about our evening prayers." Martha smiled then, and it was perhaps the most chilling thing Elijah had ever seen. "Of course you were, my dear boy. You're such a faithful son." She moved to Floyd's side, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder, and Elijah watched the young man flinch at the contact. "Now, preacher, the storm is passing. Perhaps it would be best if you sought shelter elsewhere for the night. The mountain paths can be treacherous, but I'm sure a man of your faith can find his way safely." As Elijah gathered his belongings and prepared to venture back into the night, he caught one last glimpse of Floyd's eyes. In them, he saw a desperate plea, a silent scream for salvation that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He had come to this cabin as a bearer of God's light, but he was leaving with the knowledge of a darkness so profound that it challenged everything he believed about human nature and divine justice. The fog seemed to close around him as he rode away, but the chill he felt had nothing to do with the mountain air and everything to do with the horrible certainty that he had just witnessed something that would demand a reckoning, no matter the cost. Sleep eluded Elijah that night as Floyd's broken confession echoed through his mind like the persistent toll of a funeral bell. He had found lodging at the modest inn in the settlement of Copper Creek, a ramshackle collection of buildings that served the scattered mountain folk when they ventured down from their isolated hollows. The inn's thin walls offered little comfort, and every creak of the ancient timber seemed to whisper accusations of his own cowardice. How could he have simply ridden away, leaving that tormented young man in the clutches of his monstrous mother? The question burned in his chest like acid, corroding his faith in his own moral courage. Dawn brought no relief, only the grim determination to understand the true nature of what he had witnessed. As the sun struggled through the persistent mountain mist, Elijah began his careful inquiries among the local residents. What he discovered in those first tentative conversations chilled him to the bone. The name Martha Hill was spoken in hushed tones, always accompanied by furtive glances and the unconscious crossing of oneself, as if warding off some malevolent spirit. Old Henrik, the Norwegian blacksmith whose weathered hands bore the scars of decades at the forge, was the first to offer anything resembling honesty. "That woman," he said, spitting into the coals, as if the very mention of her name left a foul taste in his mouth. "She came here from somewhere else, maybe 15 years past, claimed to be a widow seeking a new start. but there was something about her that made the dogs whine and the cattle grow restless. He paused, his pale blue eyes distant with memory. She married Samuel Hill within 6 months of arriving, and that poor man was never the same after, became quiet and withdrawn, started having these strange accidents. Fell down his own well twice, nearly drowned both times. Then, one winter morning, we found him frozen solid in his own barn, though the door was latched from the outside. The pattern that emerged from these whispered conversations painted a picture of systematic manipulation and control that extended far beyond the Hill cabin. Martha had indeed established herself as a healer of sorts, but her remedies came with a price that few seemed to understand until it was too late. Children who fell gravely ill and were saved by her ministrations would return to their families changed, distant, and unnaturally devoted to their Savior. Parents who had been desperate enough to seek her help found themselves inexplicably indebted to her, performing favors and offering tribute that kept their families bound to her will. "The carpenter boy," whispered Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress whose shop served as an unofficial gathering place for the settlement's women. Little Timothy was near death with the lung fever 3 winters back. His parents took him to Martha in desperation, and she worked her healing magic. The boy lived, praise be, but something in him changed. He stopped playing with the other children, started spending his days carving strange symbols into fence posts and barn doors. When his father tried to stop him, the boy flew into such a rage that it took 4 grown men to hold him down. Now he just sits and stares, and his parents dare not cross Martha for fear of what might happen to their other children. Sheriff Cornelius Wade proved to be exactly as unhelpful as Henrik had warned. A corpulent man in his 50s with the perpetual red nose of a dedicated drinker, Wade dismissed Elijah's concerns with the weary cynicism of someone who had long ago given up any pretense of actual law enforcement. "Preacher," he said, not bothering to look up from the bottle of whiskey that seemed to be his primary companion, "you've been riding circuit long enough to know that mountain folk got their own ways of handling things. Martha Hill might be peculiar, but she ain't broken no laws that I can prove in a court of justice. You got some wild story about unholy practices and mysterious deaths, but where is your evidence? Where are your witnesses willing to testify under oath?" Wade's indifference was not born of ignorance, but of calculated cowardice, Elijah realized. The sheriff knew exactly what Martha Hill was, but the prospect of confronting her terrified him more than the weight of his own moral failures. "Besides," Wade continued, taking another long pull from his bottle, "even if I was inclined to believe your preacher's tales, what exactly would you have me do? Ride up to that cabin with my deputy and arrest a woman for being too religious? The county judge would laugh me out of his courtroom, assuming I could even get her down from that mountain alive." It was Elara Johansson who provided the first real hope that Elijah was not entirely alone in his growing horror. Henrik's wife was a woman of perhaps 35 years, with the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving hardships that would have broken lesser souls. She approached Elijah after he had spent a fruitless morning trying to find someone, anyone, willing to speak openly about Martha Hill's influence over the community. "You're asking questions about the Hill woman," Elara said without preamble, her accent still carrying traces of her husband's Norwegian heritage. "I can see it in your eyes, the same look I had when I first started putting the pieces together." She glanced around the empty smithy where they stood, ensuring they would not be overheard. "My first husband was Samuel Hill's younger brother. I knew that family before she came into it, and I watched what she did to them all." Elara's revelations painted an even darker picture than Elijah had imagined. Martha had not simply arrived in the mountains as a mysterious widow. She had specifically targeted the Hill family because of their isolation and vulnerability. Samuel's brother, Elara's first husband, had died in what appeared to be a hunting accident just 2 years after Martha's arrival, leaving Elara a young widow with no children and few prospects. She tried to recruit me at first, Ilora explained, her voice tight with remembered fear, invited me to her special prayer meetings, offered to teach me the old healing ways. But something about the way she looked at me, the way she spoke about purification and sacrifice, made my skin crawl. When I declined her invitations, strange things started happening. My chickens died overnight, my well water turned brackish, and I started having the most terrible nightmares. Together, Elijah and Ilora began to investigate the physical evidence of Martha's activities. What they discovered in the woods surrounding the Hill property defied rational explanation and challenged even Elijah's strong stomach for the darker aspects of human nature. Carved into the bark of ancient oak trees were symbols that seemed to blend Christian iconography with something far older and more sinister. Crosses were twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Biblical verses were carved backwards or upside down, and scattered among them were markings that looked disturbingly like crude anatomical drawings. The hidden cellar that Floyd had mentioned in his desperate confession proved to be real and far more disturbing than either of them had anticipated. Accessible through a concealed entrance behind the cabin, the underground chamber was larger than the cabin itself, carved directly into the living rock of the mountain. The walls were covered with more of the strange symbols, but here they were painted in what appeared to be dried blood. Crude shelves lined the space, holding jars of preserved organs and herbs that filled the air with a sickly, sweet smell that made both investigators retch. Most disturbing of all were the shackles bolted to the stone walls and the stained altar-like table in the center of the room, its surface scarred with deep grooves that spoke of repeated use for purposes too horrible to contemplate. "Dear God," Ilora whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive atmosphere of the cellar. "How many people has she brought down here? How many children has she destroyed in the name of her twisted faith?" Their investigation did not go unnoticed by Martha, whose network of informants throughout the community was more extensive than either of them had realized. Within days of their discovery of the cellar, whispers began to circulate about the meddling preacher and the grieving widow who were stirring up trouble with their wild accusations and sacrilegious grave robbing. Martha, with her masterful understanding of mountain psychology, began to paint Elijah as a dangerous outsider intent on destroying their traditional ways and corrupting their children with modern ideas that went against the natural order of things. The transformation in the community's attitude toward Elijah was swift and absolute. Doors that had been opened to him just days before were now slammed in his face. Children who had run to greet him now hid behind their mothers' skirts, and grown men crossed to the other side of the street rather than acknowledge his presence. The isolation was not merely social, but actively hostile, and Elijah began to understand that he was now fighting, not just against Martha Hill's individual evil, but against an entire community's willful blindness to the horror in their midst. "She's turned them all against us," Ilora said during one of their clandestine meetings. "They're more afraid of facing the truth than they are of letting it continue. That's the real power she holds over them, not her healing herbs or her midnight rituals. She's convinced them that ignorance is safer than knowledge, and that questioning her authority is the same as questioning God Himself." As autumn deepened into the bitter cold of early winter, Elijah found himself trapped in an impossible position. He possessed knowledge of unspeakable evil, evidence of crimes that demanded justice, but he was powerless to act within the constraints of law and community acceptance. Every night he was haunted by the image of Floyd's desperate eyes and the certain knowledge that with each passing day, the young man's torment continued unabated. The weight of his moral obligation pressed down upon him like the mountain fog, suffocating and inescapable, demanding a response that he was not yet strong enough to provide. The memory came to Alara like a fragment of a half-forgotten nightmare, triggered by something Martha had said during a confrontation outside the general store 3 days earlier. She had been defending Elijah against accusations of stirring up trouble when Martha had smiled that cold, terrible smile and said, "Some graves are better left undisturbed, dear Alara. The dead have their secrets, and the living would be wise to respect them." The words had seemed like a simple threat at the time, but as Alara sat by her kitchen fire that night, they sparked a recollection that made her blood run cold. She found Elijah the next morning at dawn, her face pale with the urgency of revelation. "I remember now," she said, pulling him into the shadows behind the church where they could speak without being overheard. Martha's first husband, the one who died before she married Samuel Hill. His name was Jeremiah Croft, and he owned a considerable spread of land up on Devil's Ridge, prime timber country that would have been worth a fortune to the right buyer. When he died, everyone assumed the land would go to his brothers back in Virginia, but Martha produced a will that left everything to her. The pieces of Martha's calculated evil began to fit together with horrifying clarity. Jeremiah Croft had been a prosperous widower in his 50s, lonely and susceptible to the attentions of a younger woman who claimed to understand his grief. According to the stories that Alara had dismissed as gossip at the time, he had fallen gravely ill within months of their marriage, suffering from a mysterious, wasting sickness that the local doctor attributed to a weak constitution and the harsh mountain climate. He lingered for nearly a year, Alara continued, her voice tight with growing understanding. Growing thinner and weaker every day, but Martha nursed him so devotedly that the inn revoked his lodging privileges, and even the church itself was closed to him by a congregation that had been thoroughly convinced of his malicious intentions. The isolation was more than social, it was actively hostile and potentially dangerous. Elijah began to notice men following him as he moved through the settlement, their faces hard with the kind of righteous anger that could easily turn violent. His horse was found with its saddle cut to ribbons, his few remaining possessions were vandalized, and threatening messages appeared nailed to trees along the paths he traveled. The message was clear: leave now, or face consequences that the community would be all too willing to inflict. Even Alara, his one remaining ally, began to waver under the tremendous pressure being applied by her neighbors and former friends. "They're threatening Henrik's business," she told Elijah during what would prove to be their final clandestine meeting. "No one will bring their horses to be shod or their tools to be repaired as long as he allows me to associate with you. We have children to think about, mouths to feed. I cannot ask my family to sacrifice everything for a fight we cannot win." The weight of moral isolation pressed down upon Elijah like the mountain snow, cold and suffocating and seemingly endless. He had uncovered proof of Martha's crimes, documented evidence that should have been sufficient to ensure justice, but he had underestimated the power of a community's desire to avoid uncomfortable truths. The people of Copper Creek were not evil in themselves, but their collective cowardice in the face of Martha's manipulation had made them complicit in her continued reign of terror. Each night, as he lay alone in the crude shelter he had constructed in the woods outside the settlement, Elijah was haunted not only by Floyd's desperate confession, but by his own growing understanding that individual righteousness was powerless against systematic moral failure. The horror was not simply that Martha Hill existed, but that an entire community had chosen to protect her rather than confront the implications of her evil, and in doing so had become monsters themselves, willing to sacrifice innocence and truth on the altar of their own comfort and willful ignorance. The collapse came not as a sudden breaking, but as a slow erosion, like water wearing away stone, until nothing remained but dust and regret. For 3 weeks, Elijah had maintained his vigil in the crude shelter he had constructed from fallen timber and canvas, surviving on what little food he could forage and the bitter stream water that tasted of iron and despair. Each morning brought fresh evidence of the community's determination to drive him away. His makeshift camp ransacked, his few possessions scattered or destroyed. Crude threats carved into nearby trees with a language that would have made a sailor blush. The physical hardships were nothing compared to the spiritual agony that consumed him as he watched justice slip away like morning mist in the mountain sun. Sheriff Wade's capitulation was as predictable as it was devastating. Under enormous pressure from the town's leading citizens, who had made it clear that his continued employment depended upon his willingness to end this unfortunate business, the sheriff formally closed his investigation into the remains found at the Croft homestead. His official report, filed with the county courthouse and copied to the state authorities, concluded that the bones belonged to an unknown transient who had died of natural causes and been buried by persons unknown, possibly out of misguided Christian charity. Martha Hill, the report stated, was entirely innocent of any wrongdoing and had cooperated fully with the investigation despite being subjected to harassment and false accusations by unstable individuals with questionable motives. "There's nothing more I can do," Wade told the assembled townspeople during an impromptu gathering at the church, his words slurred with whiskey and shame. "I've examined all the evidence, interviewed every witness, and consulted with legal experts in the county seat. There is simply no proof of any criminal activity, and I will not allow this community to be torn apart by the wild fantasies of an outsider who has clearly lost his grip on sanity and decency." The finality of those words hit Elijah like a physical blow, driving him to his knees in the muddy clearing where he had been hiding to listen. Everything he had worked for, all the evidence he had painstakingly gathered, the horrible truth he had risked everything to expose, dismissed with the casual indifference of men who valued their comfort more than justice. Floyd Hill would remain trapped in his nightmare, subjected to unspeakable torments, while an entire community looked the other way. And Martha would continue her reign of calculated evil with the full protection of law and social order. The spiritual crisis that followed was unlike anything Elijah had experienced in his 24 years of life. He had entered the ministry with the unshakable conviction that God's justice was absolute and inevitable, that good would always triumph over evil if righteous men were willing to stand up and fight for what was right. But here, in these cursed mountains, he had discovered a darkness so profound and a complicity so complete that it seemed to mock the very foundations of his faith. If God existed, if divine justice was real, how could such monstrous evil be allowed to flourish under the protection of willful ignorance and moral cowardice? For days he wandered the high ridges like a man possessed, raging at the silent peaks and the indifferent sky, demanding answers from a heaven that seemed to have abandoned this God-forsaken corner of creation. His prayers became accusations, his scripture readings became bitter recitations of God's broken promises, and his sermons, delivered to empty forest clearings, became the ravings of a man whose faith had been shattered against the immovable rock of human evil. He had failed Floyd Hill as surely as he had failed every other victim of Martha's systematic destruction, and the weight of that failure pressed down upon him like a burial shroud. It was Alara who found him during his darkest hour, collapsed beside a mountain stream with his clothes torn and his face gaunt with starvation and despair. She had defied her husband's explicit orders and the community's hostile warnings to seek him out, driven by a guilt that matched his own and a desperate need to offer what comfort she could to a man who had sacrificed everything in the name of truth and justice. "You cannot continue like this," she said, her voice gentle but firm, as she helped him to a sitting position and offered him bread and water from her own provisions. "You are destroying yourself for a fight that cannot be won through conventional means, and your death will not save Floyd or any of the others who suffer under her power. Elijah looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and believed too little. Then what would you have me do, Elara? Accept that evil triumphs, turn my back on that tortured young man, and walk away, as if his suffering means nothing? I came here believing that God's justice was absolute, but I have learned that it is nothing against human cowardice and willful blindness. Elara settled beside him on the rocky bank, her own face marked by the strain of recent weeks. My first husband used to tell me that the measure of a man's strength was not in how hard he could strike, but in how long he could endure, she said quietly. You have been striking at walls of stone, trying to tear down Martha's empire through force and exposure, but perhaps there is another way. Perhaps instead of trying to convince the world of her evil, you should focus on saving the one soul that still can be saved. Her words sparked something in Elijah's devastated spirit, a flicker of purpose that had nothing to do with grand gestures or public vindication. Floyd Hill did not need a crusader or a prosecutor. He needed someone willing to reach into the darkness and pull him toward the light, regardless of the cost or the likelihood of success. The battle was not for the community's acknowledgement of Martha's crimes, but for the salvation of a young man whose soul was being systematically destroyed by the woman who should have protected him. You speak of saving him, Elijah said, his voice hoarse from days of shouting at an indifferent universe. But how does one save a man from his own mother? How does one break chains that have been forged from birth and strengthened by years of calculated torment? Elara was quiet for a long moment, listening to the sound of the stream and the whisper of wind through the bare branches overhead. I do not know, she admitted finally, but I know that your current path leads only to your own destruction and accomplishes nothing for the person you are trying to help. Sometimes salvation comes not through grand gestures, but through simple human connection, through showing someone that they are not alone in their suffering and that there is another way to live. That night, as they made their way down from the high ridges toward the settlements below, an orange glow began to pulse against the dark sky from the direction of Devil's Ridge. At first, they assumed it was merely the aurora that sometimes painted the northern horizon during the colder months. But as they drew closer, the acrid smell of burning wood and the distant sound of crackling flames told a different story. From somewhere in the darkness ahead came an eerie sound that made both of them freeze in their tracks. A rhythmic chanting that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Multiple voices raised in what might have been prayer or incantation, the words too distant to understand, but the tone unmistakably ritualistic and deeply unsettling. The hill cabin was burning. The flames had consumed everything with a hunger that seemed almost supernatural, reducing the hill cabin to a smoldering skeleton of charred timber and collapsed stone by the time Elijah and Elara reached the clearing. The acrid smoke hung thick in the mountain air, carrying with it the smell of burned wood and something else, something that made both of them cover their faces with whatever cloth they could find. The ritualistic chanting they had heard from the ridge had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt heavier than any sound could have been. Sheriff Wade arrived at dawn with a handful of reluctant volunteers, men whose faces betrayed their relief that Martha's reign of terror might finally be ending, even as they maintained the pretense of civic duty and concern for the tragedy that had befallen their community. The search through the ruins was methodical and grim, the men working in shifts to avoid prolonged exposure to the choking smoke and the psychological weight of what they expected to find among the ashes and debris. The first body was discovered in what had been the main room of the cabin, the skeletal remains so thoroughly burned that identification would have been impossible were it not for the distinctive silver locket that had somehow survived the inferno. Martha Hill had worn that locket every day for as long as anyone could remember, claiming it contained a lock of her sainted mother's hair and a fragment of scripture that protected her from harm. The irony of its survival while its owner had been reduced to charred bone and ash was lost on no one who witnessed its recovery from the smoking ruins. But it was the second discovery that sent shockwaves through the assembled searchers and provided the final devastating confirmation of Martha's systematic evil. Deep beneath the collapsed floor of the cabin, in what must have been the hidden cellar that Elijah and Alara had discovered weeks earlier, they found the remains of another victim entirely. The bones were those of a young man, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, and unlike the fire-damaged skeleton above, these remains showed clear signs of having been there for years, carefully preserved in the cool underground chamber like some grotesque trophy. "Dear God," whispered Dr. Morrison, the settlement's physician who had been called in to examine the remains. "This boy has been dead for at least 3 or 4 years, maybe longer. Look at the condition of the clothing, the way the bones have settled. And these marks on the skull, the fractures around the temple, this was no natural death." The identification came from an unexpected source. Old Henrik, his weathered face pale with recognition and dawning horror, stepped forward to examine the tattered remnants of clothing that still clung to the skeleton. "That jacket," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made the buckles for that jacket myself. Special order for the Whitman boy from over Black Creek Way." Thomas Whitman went missing in the spring of 1883, just vanished without a trace while hunting ginseng in these mountains. His family searched for months, offered rewards, questioned every soul for miles. Around, Martha herself helped with the search, I remember, brought them food, and offered prayers for the boy's safe return. The pieces of Martha's monstrous puzzle fell into place with horrifying clarity. Thomas Whitman had not been her first victim, nor would Floyd have been her last. She had been systematically luring young men to her isolated cabin, using her reputation as a healer and her carefully cultivated image of maternal concern to gain their trust before subjecting them to unspeakable torments in the hidden chamber beneath her home. How many others had there been? How many missing persons from neighboring settlements could be traced back to encounters with the seemingly charitable widow who offered aid to travelers and comfort to the troubled? Floyd himself was found 3 days later, discovered by a hunting party nearly 5 miles from the burned cabin, wandering through the forest in a state of complete mental dissociation. He was alive but barely recognizable as the terrified young man Elijah had first encountered that stormy night weeks earlier. His clothes were singed and his hands burned from contact with flame, but his injuries were not life-threatening. What was most disturbing was his complete inability to communicate coherently about what had happened or how he had come to be so far from the scene of the fire. "He just keeps repeating the same phrases over and over," Dr. Morrison explained to the small group that had gathered to discuss Floyd's condition and future care. "Something about purification through fire, about breaking the chains of sin, about finally being clean. His mind seems to have retreated into itself as a protection against whatever trauma he experienced. Whether he set the fire himself or was merely present when it started, I cannot say, but the burns on his hands suggest direct contact with flame." Alara stepped forward without hesitation, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "He will come home with Henrik and me," she declared, her eyes daring anyone to object. "That boy has suffered enough at the hands of people who claim to love him. If there is any hope for his healing, it will come through patience and genuine care, not through institutions or abandonment to the mercies of strangers." The decision was not met with universal approval, but the community's collective guilt over their years of willful blindness to Martha's crimes made it difficult for anyone to voice strong objections. Floyd Hill had become a symbol of their own moral failure, a living reminder of the price of choosing comfortable ignorance over difficult truth, and caring for him represented a small step toward some form of redemption. In the weeks that followed, As winter tightened its grip on the mountains and the immediate shock of Martha's death began to fade, Elijah found himself grappling with the complex emotions that came with this strange form of victory. He had not achieved the grand, public vindication he had originally sought. There would be no trial, no formal condemnation of Martha's crimes, no official acknowledgement of the systematic evil that had been allowed to flourish under the protection of community denial. The truth would be whispered in fragments, shared in hushed conversations, and gradually absorbed into the collective memory as yet another dark chapter in the long history of human cruelty. Yet something profound had changed in the mountains, something that could not be measured in courtroom victories or newspaper headlines. Floyd Hill was free, rescued from a hell that had defined his entire existence, and while his recovery would be slow and perhaps never complete, he now had the chance to discover who he might have been without his mother's monstrous influence. The hidden chamber with its instruments of torture had been reduced to ash. The occult symbols carved into trees had been cut down and burned, and the community itself had been forced to confront the consequences of their collective cowardice. As Elijah prepared to leave Copper Creek for the final time, his horse loaded with the few possessions he had managed to salvage from his months in exile, he found himself changed in ways that went far deeper than his gaunt frame and prematurely gray hair. He had entered these mountains as a young idealist convinced that righteousness would always triumph over evil if good men were willing to fight for justice. He was leaving as someone who understood that victory sometimes came not in grand gestures, but in quiet acts of human compassion, not in public vindication, but in private salvation, not in the punishment of the guilty, but in the protection of the innocent. The last thing he saw as he rode away from the settlement was Floyd Hill sitting on Ilara's front porch with a wooden carving in his hands, patiently working the knife through the soft pine as Henrik had taught him. The young man's face was still marked by shadows and sudden starts at unexpected sounds, but there was something new there as well, something that might eventually grow into peace. Elijah carried that image with him as he descended from the mountains, knowing that sometimes the most important victories were the ones that no one else would ever fully understand or acknowledge, and that truth, however painful its pursuit, was always worth the cost of its revelation.